Well, I'm going to take my 2 minutes to tell you a little bit about what I've done in the public sector, which would be directly relevant to this race and what might come afterwards. I've been in the private sector most of my working life. I had 2 stints of 6.5 years each in the public sector. The first was in the Justice Department as the United States Attorney in Massachusetts for 5 years, and as head of the criminal division of the Justice Department in Washington for the better part of 2 years. My emphasis was on public corruption cases, which was prosecuting corrupt officials who'd stolen money from programs that belonged to the taxpayers. And also I emphasized civil actions and forfeiture to directly recover those monies for the benefit of the taxpayers. As governor, I was in from 91 to 97, mid-97. I was rated the most conservative and the most libertarian governor in the United States. You know, I was way fiscal conservative, cut spending in absolute dollars, and I came in when the state was on its back, and the unemployment rate went from the highest among the industrialized states to the lowest. So in 1994, when we came for re-election, we got 71% of the vote, because we've been very compassionate, very conservative. I had, frankly, led the country in terms of gay and lesbian issues with executive orders, and I appointed the woman who wrote the decision holding that gay marriage was constitutionally compelled, and that led to the Supreme Court case, which led to everything for marriage equality. My speech to the Republican convention in Houston, I was a new governor in 1992. I'm okay for a minute, right?
It's an additional minute.
So my speech to the Republican convention was short. And the theme was, and the founding statement was, my philosophy of government is I want the government out of your pocketbook and out of your bedroom. And that's a concise statement of my philosophy. Of course, the Pat Buchanan people in the front rows booed lustily and said, that's it, he just admitted it, he's gay, which shows you how flexible they were in their acceptance of a tolerant philosophy. My guiding philosophy was that there's no such thing as government money, there's only taxpayers' money, and that has stayed with me. Thank you.
Short and sweet. Who did more damage, Bush or Obama, and why?
You mean to the budget or to the country?
Yes.
Well, I don't know. I think that the Iraq invasion, in retrospect, turns out to have been, to understate it, always Yankee understatement, not such a great idea. And it's inflamed the Sunni-Shia conflict in the Middle East, which is one of the most dangerous examples of religious sectarianism in the world. And it's not, and the sequelae in Libya and Benghazi and other countries in the Middle East have not been successful. Those were under Obama. So on a foreign policy point, I'd say both. The other thing is spending. And by the time President Obama leaves office, our deficit is going to be $20 trillion. That's a Bush-Obama deficit. You go back to Bill Clinton, there's nothing like that deficit. I'd rate it a tie.
The question is, what role does culture play in creating a government that infringes our liberty, and what, if anything, can be done about it?
Well, I had thought the question was, what role does culture play in what the future of our polity is going to be? And if that's the proposition, I think that culture has a huge defensive role to play against us falling into a very unattractive position. Sir Kenneth Clark, the author of the book Civilization, said if you want to know how elevated a civilization is, look in the book of its art. And you see freedom of expression, and you see the kind of commentary that the great artists of the day are able to make on the society of the day. And I think they've gone hand in hand with some of the greatest civilizations in history. A subset of that would be freedom of the press, which is certainly a culture in the United States, although under attack, and that is a major bulwark against governmental power and a contributor to pluralism, which I think are two cultural aspects promotive of the kind of political society I want to see.
How much of practical politics can be derived from the non-aggression principle? What other principles must be added to the non-aggression principle in judging policy positions?
Well, I certainly don't think a government should be run on the aggression principle only, although there's a lot of evidence that one of the major candidates for president this year feels that in his bones. And that way madness lies. We're going to be an outlier as a nation. We'll be violating all of our treaties. We'll be violating all of our international obligations. We'll be violating international law. We will be the rogue nation. We'll be the North Korea of the next 8 years if that happens. So, flipping it on its side, obviously that's a non-starter. I do think that the construct of a system of laws which can cabin and crib people around so that one bad person cannot make things happen in Washington, that is important. It's going to demand skill sets other than purely non-aggression. It will demand putting yourself in the position of your interlocutor across the table and thinking what's necessary to reach common ground, but maybe most people would think that's pretty non-aggressive. It's certainly not what they do in Washington today.
Should the U.S. be part of international organizations like NATO or the UN? Why or why not?
So I do think there's an issue of mission creep with NATO, looking for new things to do, and a possibility of having outlived the original charter. So I think that's a legit topic to consider. Getting out of the UN, I've spent so much time in foreign countries in the last 10 years. I'm on an international foreign heads of state group that meets once a year to talk about issues such as water, food, nuclear war, religious sectarianism, and I hear about problems all over the world. And I go to other countries, mostly third world countries, with my business hat on, and I see all this suffering, and it's caused by governments. So I would stay in the UN to try to reach those problems of the citizenry by putting the heat on the governments.
What would be the first politically achievable, emphasize that, reform in the tax code that you would fight for?
Well, I would fight for a 10 to 20% reduction in the size of the federal government, whether it's a reform of the fundamental system of taxation from the current system to a consumption-based tax, as Governor Johnson favors, or the alternative that I studied carefully when Steve Forbes ran for president, which is a flat tax of 17 to 19%. I don't have a dog really in that fight. I'd studied them both, but I think there's just so much waste and fat in the federal government that it would be a reduction in the size of government. I let go 10% of the state workforce my first day in office in Massachusetts. I never received so much as a postcard about where those essential employees ever went.
As a Canadian, it seems to me that our Queen grants us about as much freedom as your president. Do you think that all the blood spilled in the American Revolution was therefore worth it? And when do you personally recommend armed rebellion?
Well, I very much think all the blood spilled in the American Revolution was worth it to throw off a system of government that was authoritarian and that thrust the individual in a corner. That would be us. And that's been of lasting benefit to us and to the world, which is why I think we should pay particular attention this year to proposals to have a possible president of the United States forswear all American law, and not all, but some American law and treaty violations in violation of the Constitution, to erect walls between countries, something there is that does not love a wall, and there's a reason for that, to take on unilaterally killing the families of people who are suspected of bad activities against the United States. That's a violation of the Constitution, okay? So I think that shows a pattern of disregarding the lessons of, I think that shows a pattern of disregarding the lessons of history and the lessons of law, and it may be time for a little bit more revolution, and the revolution this year, politically, is the Libertarian Party.
The question is this: does the term libertarian have a branding problem? And if so, what should we do about it?
Well, I think there's something in the question. You know, maybe that libertarian and libertarianism should not be the first word we put in the ears of the voters. You know, some voters do hear libertine, and they think, oh boy, there's going to be a whole bunch of unattractive people in our neighborhood as a result if we sign up on this petition. If you cut to the substance, and instead of opening with that word, you say, well, we're on the ballot in all 50 states. This is what we think. We don't agree with the Dems or the Rs. We think A, B, C, D, okay? 55% of the country agrees with us. And then you can come back to describe, in general terms, freedom and liberty. In my part of the country, New England, the state motto of New Hampshire is live free or die. I love that motto. I love that motto. It's the only thing on my card, which is at your places. Live free. Now, live free is not going to excite any antipathetic reaction, and maybe that's the way to go.
All right, so now we're going to have closing statements.
So I will be eternally grateful to my dying breath to Gary Johnson for offering me the opportunity to be a part of these proceedings with him this year. And I do think that together, if Gary and I divide the work equally, which we're going to do, I think we can accomplish quite a lot for the country and for the party this year. As I said earlier, I don't think we should say boo on this person or boo on that person, but we should point out affably that we don't agree with either party, that we're, you know, to the right on fiscal stewardship, we're to the left on issues of personal freedom, and then ask people, well, what do you think? Because about 50% of the country is going to say, that sounds okay to me. And the next step, again, as I mentioned, is to speak truth to power, reveal the emperor for wearing no clothes on those issues where the emperor in either party is wearing no clothes. And I think what that is going to do is enable us to make a run on the gridlock that has gripped the country, lead the country to discourse, and bring us to a situation where we can either be part of a very enjoyable, tumultuous conclusion to the election season this year, perhaps to the great benefit of the Libertarian Party, or at the very least have helped the country out of its doldrums and the miasma that has gripped our ruling parties in Washington, D.C. Both of them. Thank you.
Ask a Libertarian Facebook fan page is spreading awareness of libertarianism and informing non-libertarians while empowering those who support liberty on a daily basis. This is your opportunity to be empowered, and let us advocate libertarianism for you at facebook.com/askalibertarian.